When I was provincial, there was no great movement for any type of canonization for Theodore Foley. He was probably what Victor called a household saint. But the Italians and the Spanish began pushing the general to start some sort of a process for canonization for Theodore. So the general began to say, we really can't start anything unless the province gets involved where he was from. So he finally called me and said, you got to get someone to put together a story about Theodore Foley, because unless we get something going in your province, then nothing's going to happen. So with that, I asked Vic to write the little brochure, monograph that he was talking about. So that's how Victor got involved and got enthusiastic as a result of his own study. Now, we came from Scranton as students right after VJ Day. In fact, I shouldn't say after VJ. VJ Day happened while we were here in the monastery. And Theodore was our professor in theology. Probably we're among the very first class that he taught. He was ordained in 40. You figure a sacred eloquence year, 2 or 3 years at Catholic University, 45 he taught us. My own recollection of those times was he was a very pleasant, easygoing teacher, very clear in his class material. And looking back over that year, I would say that in no way was Theodore a radical. He taught what was in the manual. The manuals were the textbooks of those days. Manual for dogmatic theology, manual for moral theology. One day, several of us went over to Riverdale. Over near Manhattan College, there was a rehab hospital, and we had one of our men there. His name was John Gerard McMenamin. Now, John Gerard had been a professor of philosophy in the province, but he contracted epilepsy, and the medical theory at the time was that because of contaminated milk in Rome. Now, whether or not that actually would stand together, but that was the medical knowledge of the day. John Gerard was a brilliant man and loved to question the students when we visited him. And on one day while we were over there, I don't know who was with me. You may have been Silva, but I can't recall that. Not that I erased you from my mind. It wasn't. But John Gerard was always picking at us, what did you learn today? What did you learn today? So I said, we learned extra ecclesia nulla salus. Oh my, he said, don't you think it should be extra caritate nulla salus? Well, the thought of questioning a teaching of the Roman Catholic Church never crossed our mind, or Theodore's either. The funny part of this is that a few years later, Father Feeney in Boston was condemned for teaching that. In 1951, I returned from Rome, and I was director of students here, and Theodore was teaching again here. And there were several things that were very interesting during that time. First of all, we found out that the Mary Louis sisters loved to have Theodore come and celebrate their morning masses. And the reason was he didn't sound like a theologian. He just gave homilies. And there was a spell during that time when Theodore was here as that teaching year that he was teaching, that there was a rumor that he was going to be named Master of Novices. He was going to replace Paul Francis Nager, who had been the Master of Novices and who had just been elected General Consultor. And in those days, my door was always open in case a student wanted to come in. And so every evening during this rumor period, Ted would go down the corridor from his room, past me, holding a glass in one hand and Alka-Seltzer in the other hand, just very apprehensive that he was going to be named Master of Novices. Then the day came, Ronald Murray had been named Master of Novices. And that evening, Theodore walked by my door like this. So I called out, "Ted, where's the Alka-Seltzer?" He says, "I don't," he used to go like grab his chin, I don't need it anymore. I don't need it anymore. I'd like to get back to Father John Gerard again. I didn't mention it before, but John not only has an epilepsy condition, but he was also an alcoholic. And frustrated by his condition and anxiously waiting for the teachers and lectors of the day, myself, to go to recreation and bait us and grill us and debate us and exhaust us right after lunch. So both Theodore and I think this was the recreation. And we'd stand at the door and find out where John Gerard was seated, and then negotiated our place into the recreation as far away from John Gerard as we could. And need I say, we both felt guilty. Then on March 24th, John had some sort of a spasm, a grand mal seizure, and fell and broke his leg. He was put into a body cast and went in Mary Immaculate Hospital. And on the 25th of March, the Gaudiamus Day, after the Mass and cocktail hour or drinks before dinner, Theodore skipped dinner, went down to the hospital to stand behind or beside John's bed. I replaced him at 3 o'clock until 7. And during the night, John Gerard had a terrible seizure. His body fought the total cast that he had on. He had a stroke and died. So that an era of where Theodore and I had not been the most charitable that we could be, finally in his deathbed tried to compensate for it. And actually, John knew what we were doing and thanked us. The last thing I want to recall about Theodore and during those years was an incident that occurred when he came to Jamaica. He had left Jamaica. He was now director of students, and he came to Jamaica to examine the students in theology. I approached him before the exam and told him that the students had a very mediocre year in their theology, because two of the professors, first of all, Burton Farrell, got sick, and Ben Kelly was sent to replace him, and then he got sick. And so the end result was the students really were deprived of a first-class year in theology. So he appreciated my alert and conducted an exam that reflected his compassion and expertise, because the students told me afterwards, in his examination, he was actually teaching them. Looking back at this period of his life, I would say that his personality and his mien was bland. Good bland, but bland. He was comfortable to be with. I never knew any strong opinions that he held. He was a good community man, took his turn with community events, packed his bag and went out on Sunday work like the rest of us. And he was active in the Theological Society and more or less did most of the work of the secretary, the official secretary of the society, Father Aloysius McDonough. He was Aloysius's gopher. As I say, at that time I was a member of the Theological Society and saw him in action as a humble man in the background. He never made a presentation, seldom, if ever, said anything from the floor, but he was just a quiet, pleasant presence. While he was director of students, I had very little contact with him. But then after being director of students for 3 years, he became rector of Pittsburgh. And he held that role as rector for 2 years and then was elected general consultor. In 1958, while he was rector of Pittsburgh, my relationship was kind of vicarious. I was never stationed in Pittsburgh once we left the novitiate, but when he heard that the provincial had sent me to Florida to recuperate from hepatitis, he used to call me periodically and send money to me to make life easier. I often realized Theodore was a very thoughtful and considerate man. My contact with Theodore was minimal when he became general consultor. He held that job for 6 years, and then in '64 was elected our superior general. And my first contact with him that I recall was the provincial chapter of 1965. I was a delegate at that meeting, and it became notable because of a confrontation Theodore had with Gerard Rooney, the provincial. Father Victor referred to this obliquely, but this is more of the detail work. Father Harold Reusch was superior in the Philippines, and as superior, he had been invited by Gerard, the provincial, to attend and listen, but not to talk. Harold was very upset with Gerard for one big reason. He had been forbidden to begin a foundation of the Passionist community in the Philippines. Gerard had told him to build the local church, get diocesan priests, and then when you've accomplished that, then you can work on the congregation. He discussed this with Richard Kugelman privately after he arrived back in the United States. And Richard, in his own simple way, asked the general if Harry could address the chapter and tell him all about his experience in the Passionist missionaries in the Philippines. With that, Harry had his opening, and he laid it all out before the chapter and the general. Theodore had never heard of this situation that Gerard Rooney had imposed on Harold. And after he questioned Harold at length publicly before us all, he turned on Gerard the provincial and said, "Father Provincial, I revoke your command." And then he turned to Harold, and his Father Harold found the congregation as well as the diocese. The bland Theodore showed he had fire in the belly. A year or so after the provincial chapter, I got a call from him. At this time, I'm up in Riverdale. I've been sent to Riverdale to begin the retreat house. And he asked me to be the representative in the United States for the Passionist nuns, who had nobody, who their own juridic situation was so strange. They were all like diocesan local units. And so the Holy See had asked Theodore to please help the nuns. So in Spain and Italy and the other places where the nuns were, Theodore appointed someone to do it. So for about a year, I visited all of the different convents here in the United States, and I made a brief report because it was pretty much the nuns' work and I was only facilitating it. And after I made the report to him, he called me back again. He said, "Now I'd like you to come to Rome because we're going to form a commission of all of you people with some of the superiors of the nuns. I says, Ted, I can't come to Rome. I'm tied up to my neck up here into getting this retreat house started. Oh, he said, I forgot about that. So he says, who would you recommend? So I said, I'd recommend Damien Towie, who never forgave me. And off he went to Rome, and he was working with a group of Spanish and Italian Passionist priests to help the nuns come wherever they are today. In 1968, the General Chapter, the gentleman who had been elected Superior General was recognized at this point as a strong leader. Silently, he guided the congregation through a stormy session in the extraordinary chapter he convoked to examine and update our life. Cashin may remember more instances than I, but I recall 3 momentous interventions he made, interrupting the direction the chapter was taking. I should mention, Theodore just sat there. That picture is perfect. Just sat there, presiding over the chapter, hardly ever saying a word. His presence was sufficient, so that when he spoke, people listened. In the very first session of the chapter, after a couple of weeks, it became evident that we were coming close to an impasse. The emotions were very high. Feelings on all sides were controlling the discussions. We were getting more emotional than rational. And suddenly, out of the blue, Theodore announced that tomorrow there would be no meeting. It would be a day of recreation and party spirit. And as a result, various groups sang, jokes were told, and we ate and drank more than we needed. The end result was the whole group relaxed, a feeling of brotherhood and comradeship developed, and we returned the next day with a complete shift of attitude, just calling us to stop the nonsense and relax. The second thing I remember vividly is updating the habit. At a time when all kinds of religious women were updating their religious garb, a motion was made that we should update our dress, literally our dress. And Theodore joined the debate in speaking in favor of updating our habit. The Spanish, Theodore sort of sat up here, and some of the consultants, general consultants, were down below him. And while Theodore was making this statement in favor of changing the habit, the Spanish general consultant sitting in front of him was having apoplexy. Heated debate followed, and eventually Costante Brevetto moved to table the proposal. It is still on the table. I remember Augustin Paul Cooney, the Japanese superior, said if he knew this was going to be a discussion, he would have come with his kimono on. Theodore did not believe in updating the habit. But before that session, the Spanish consultant, knowing that the proposal was going to be on the floor, asked him to speak vehemently against the proposal. And Theodore, who did not understand Italian Spanish, misunderstood, and in a spirit of unanimity with his consultors, did what he thought the Spanish wanted. He was embarrassed to tears afterwards when he realized he had mixed it up completely. And the last thing I remember vividly was the question about the hour's prayer. And it was the last time I remember Theodore intervening. The Committee on Prayer, on Community Life, when it came to the area of prayer, changed the rule in their presentation and recommended that instead of an hour a day, there should be a half hour, and that would be adequate. But Theodore, speaking very intensely, said that our spirit of prayer was not going to be safeguarded by such a minimalist change. And his intervention saved what is now in our constitutions an hour of prayer. As everybody noticed, Theodore grew in the job. He became more and more the leader of the congregation. And his strength of character became more and more evident. The bland, if not reticent man of the 40s tolerated no nonsense. But the iron fist was always in a soft glove. He really didn't have to raise his voice to make his point, and he always seemed to have such a placid spirit. Towards the end of the first session of the Extraordinary General Chapter, things, after the recreation day, things had begun to get testy again. And the private meetings of the CCC evidenced this division back in the chapter. So Theodore approached me and asked me if I would come to the meetings of the CCC and moderate the meetings. I needed to keep the lions and the tigers from destroying each other. I was doing that for about a week, and at the end of one difficult session, as we ended the session, Theodore motioned to me to join him walking in the garden. We were no sooner out of the building than Theodore exploded. Who does that crowd think they are? They are not going to destroy this congregation. They cannot stop the work of the Holy Spirit. He fumed and expostulated. I marveled at his anger. I had never seen it so boldly expressed and so masterfully done. He didn't swear once. But there was no doubt about his anger or his feelings. And after almost an hour of ranting and raving, he calmed down, regained his composure, and the two of us walked into John and Paul's, and no one knew what I had just experienced. As he re-entered the monastery, smiling to all, my bland professor could be a tiger. Is Theodore Foley a saint? What is a saint? Victor, I think, made some good distinctions this morning. He certainly was a wonderful human being. He certainly was a faithful passionist and priest in every dimension. He certainly was admired by all who met him, and he was comfortable in nearly every situation. He was convinced of the values of our community and lived them. He was a providential captain of the ship during a tumultuous time. Theodore was a wonderful, holy man. And maybe that's all we should demand, to be called a saint.